everyone, and welcome to Biology Professor. Make sure that you subscribe for more free biology study videos, and please make sure you check out the link in the description that will take you to a folder where you can get a lot of free study notes. So these are PDFs, basically all of my board pictures. So I'll have a picture of this whole board with all of my notes and all of the correct answers written in, and you can get those for free at the link below. Now let's go ahead and get started. Today's topic is passive immunity, and this includes passive inoculation. Some people have a tendency to use these terms interchangeably, and they are related but not interchangeable. So keep an eye out, and I'll show you how they're different. Before we jump into talking about passive immunity, I really want to talk about active immunity for just a second to make sure you understand the distinction. So this first point is about active immunity. Now, active immunity is when an immune system develops a natural immune response to an antigen that has entered the body, such as during an infection. So this active immunity is what you typically think of when you think about just a natural immune response when someone is infected with some kind of pathogen. So it results in full immunity. That means you've got B cells, and you've got T cells, you've got antibodies, you've got memory B cells and memory T cells, just that full, robust immune response. So now let's talk about how passive immunity is different. Passive immunity occurs when an individual receives antibodies from another individual. So whereas active immunity is when someone is making their own immune response, including their own antibodies, passive immunity is when an individual receives antibodies from another individual. Now, I do have another video on antibody structure and function, so if you want to learn more about antibodies, what they look like, how they work, check that one out. So passive immunity, an individual receiving antibodies from another individual rather than making their own. Now, this results in some protection. Yes, somebody receiving antibodies from another person, those antibodies can then help defend that person against a specific pathogen. But there's no memory here. Now, technically, antibodies, we typically associate those with immune system memory. And that when an immune system recognizes a pathogen, basically recognizes an antigen from a pathogen that it's seen before, it will start producing antibodies as well as other immune defenses against that pathogen. So the person, the other individual whose immune system made these antibodies, that is based on immune memory. But the person who receives the antibodies, they just receive these antibodies, and their own immune system will not gain any kind of memory to the pathogen the way they would in an actual infection. Now, there's two kinds of passive immunity. There is natural passive immunity and artificial passive immunity. I do have a diagram over here showing how you've got immunity, adaptive immunity, artificial versus natural, and within each of these you've got active versus passive, and we'll talk about specific examples here at the end. But looking just at the natural and the artificial, so talking basically about this one right here, the second one, and this fourth one, those are our passive immunities. With natural passive immunity, this is when antibodies are passed from a mother to her offspring via either the placenta. Remember, the placenta is an organ that is grown during childbirth, or not during childbirth, during pregnancy, during that early development in the uterus for basically nutrients to be given to the growing baby. So IgG, or immunoglobulin G, is the type of antibody that a mother will pass to her baby via the placenta. Another way that a mother can pass antibodies, basically share antibodies with her offspring, is via breast milk when she is feeding her baby. And that's going to be IgA, or immunoglobulin A. Again, if you're not familiar with IgG or IgA or the other types of antibodies, check out my video on antibody structure and function just for some more detail there. But so this is called natural passive immunity because it's a very natural process, right? Every person who's ever been born has received antibodies from their mother when they were in their mother's uterus. Any child who has been breastfed will have received antibodies from their mother during the act of breastfeeding. So that's the natural passive immunity. And now we can talk about the second type, that's the artificial passive immunity. Artificial passive immunity is when antibodies that are typically produced in a laboratory are injected into an individual to prevent or fight a specific infection. Now, this is also known as passive inoculation. Now, I said at the beginning, passive immunity and passive inoculation are not interchangeable terms. Passive inoculation is another word for this artificial passive immunity. So it's one type of passive immunity. Now here, before we move on, I want to make a couple of points clear. One is that the artificial passive immunity has to do with passing antibodies from one individual to another in a way that involves some kind of medical procedure, basically. So the antibodies can either be produced in a laboratory, or I should have written this on the board also, I'll write it right here, produced in a laboratory or donated as plasma. So if you've heard of someone donating blood, you can also donate plasma. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we've heard a lot about convalescent plasma, and that's plasma donated by a person who had previously had COVID-19 and had fought off that infection, and so would have antibodies in their blood that they could donate. So the antibodies here, they're either the ones that are going to be donated, that's the convalescent plasma, or produced in a laboratory. Another major treatment for COVID-19, especially later in the pandemic, has been with specific monoclonal antibodies. I'm going to put that in parentheses here. So this would be the kind that's produced in a laboratory, monoclonal antibodies. But either way, I know people personally in my life who received convalescent plasma when they were hospitalized with COVID-19 from a donor. And I know people who received a monoclonal antibody treatment in the hospital when they were sick with COVID-19 later in the pandemic. So both of those are types of artificial passive immunity. So it's where you have antibodies that were either produced in a lab or donated by just some donor out there that are then injected. And really the method here, when I say injected, I don't mean like an intramuscular shot. I mean, this is an IV administration. So administered intravenously, right into like a vein. So an IV administration of these antibodies into an individual, either to prevent, right, it could be like a prophylactic treatment, so to prevent them from contracting a certain disease, perhaps, just for example, if somebody was exposed to a person who was ill, they might be administered like monoclonal antibodies prophylactically, so to prevent a disease, or to fight off a specific infection if they had already tested positive for it. And so that is the passive inoculation part. Now, in either form of passive immunity, so either natural or artificial, the transferred antibodies, whether it's coming from a mother to her offspring via placenta or breast milk, or whether it was an intravenous administration of monoclonal antibodies or convalescent plasma, either way, Antibodies have a half-life. They don't last forever. And so those transferred antibodies will be, to get kind of low here, degraded. Okay, will be degraded over time. So degraded over time, typically this is several months, 3 to 6 months, kind of depends. But basically once the antibodies have been received, they only last several months. And once that time has passed, they will have been degraded, and that immunity, that passive immunity, will have been eliminated unless more antibodies are transferred. So passive immunity tends to be transient, whereas active immunity, this full immune response, particularly because it's got the memory cells, it can last decades, last an entire lifetime, because there are those memory cells ready and waiting to recognize that pathogen again and to mount an immune response if it comes. So now let's take a look at this diagram. We've got the innate and adaptive arms of immunity. Within the adaptive arm, there's the artificial and the natural, like we've been talking about. And for both artificial and natural, we have active and passive components. So I'm just going to summarize those here. Artificial, active, this is going to generate memory, and this is what would happen, for example, from a vaccine. So a vaccine is artificial in the sense that it's not like a natural infection, but it's very active. So it's going to result in full immunity. A person who gets a vaccine is going to have B cells and T cells and antibodies and memory cells to fight off the pathogen and to remember it in the future. So that's the artificial active component, and yes, there's memory with that. The artificial passive component is like what we were talking about right here. So this is where you've got like convalescent plasma, or I'm actually going to write, just as the example here, monoclonal antibodies. There's no memory, but it can be a good way to increase immunity for a temporary amount of time. So that's the artificial passive. Looking at the natural end of things, the active natural situation that results in memory, this would be such as during an infection. So just like your regular garden variety infection, a person contracts an infection, they are colonized by a pathogen, their immune system naturally mounts this active memory response to an infection. And then finally, that natural passive immune response with no memory, this is where I'm going to write maternal antibodies. So maternal antibodies, again, it's kind of a short-term, transient sort of protection that can last, a few to several months, just until that baby's immune system has matured and it's making a lot of its own antibodies, several months after birth and after breastfeeding has concluded. So that brings us to the end for passive immunity and passive inoculation. Thank you for watching. Make sure you go down to that link to get the free study notes. Make sure you subscribe, and I will see you next time. Good luck with all of your studying. Bye.